Did you know that Fannie Mae just changed the requirements for what HOAs have to hold as their reserve? Hi, I'm Mark Ganley, partner founder of GC Realty Development, a property manager here in the Chicago market, and also co-host of Chicago's #1 real estate investing podcast, Straight Up Chicago Investor. So what I found out last week was that Fannie Mae increased their reserve requirement for HOAs from 10 to 15%. And what that means is in order for a condominium complex, HOA, to be warrantable. Now this includes townhouses and also traditional condo building. In order for those to be warrantable, which means basically warrantable means that Fannie Mae will lend to these properties, one of the requirements is that they have 15% of their annual budget in reserves and no less. Now up until, for many years, it's only been 10%, which that was never a number that was strategically came up with. That's just a number that, because think about big properties that have tons of amenities are going to have a much more requirement versus something that was built last year. So 10% has always just been this artificial number, and they increased that to 15%. Now, if you're buying in a HOA, if you're buying in a condominium complex or a townhouse, there's important things that I want to make sure, if anything we take away from this video, as an investor, or even if you're looking at owner-occupied, to consider, because these are things that will come back and bite you in the butt. So if you are buying in a condo, and I just went through this process a couple weeks ago, we're buying a house to flip, a townhouse to flip here in Elgin, that I kind of went through this checklist, but requesting a reserve study. Now I'm going to flip this place, so the reserves, how much is going to be required for the upcoming years is less important to me, but when I go to sell it to that buyer, I want to make sure I'm not going to run into any issues. So requesting a reserve study, and a reserve study is something that a HOA led by the board. So HOAs always have a condominium board. It might be made up of, call it 3 to 7 actual owners, and there's no other requirements short of being voted in by your other unit owners in that HOA. So this board is to have a reserve study requested. I think Fannie Mae wants it done every 3 years. And in that reserve study, and it usually costs a good amount of money, $5,000 to $10,000. There's companies out there, that's all they do is reserve studies. So they'll come out and they'll look at every part of your property. If you're a townhouse community, if you're a condominium building, they're gonna look at structural, they're gonna look at windows, they're gonna look at tuck pointing, they're gonna look at roofs, they're gonna look at the HVAC systems, they're gonna look at the hallway carpet, they're gonna look at the mailboxes. And they're gonna say, hey, these things have only this much life left. They're gonna look at the parking lot, that's another big one. These things only have this much life left, and if you get this replaced in 4 years from now, you're going to need this much money. And they try to anticipate the cost of material, labor going up and so forth. And so they're putting together almost a study, not almost, they're putting together a study of how much this building's going to cost to keep it up to what it needs to be condition-wise over the next 10 to 20 years. And that study is supposed to also help these boards figure out how much money they need to collect on your monthly assessments in order to save enough money to be able to cover these things. Now, don't get me wrong, an HOA really has two options. They can collect just enough money to pay for the bills, and then maybe meet the reserve requirement for Fannie, and then anything else they'll just go have a special assessment. A special assessment is where the board says, hey, we need to replace this this $100,000 driveway. We're going to charge every owner, if there's 30 units, 1/30 of that, and they might owe a chunk of money, then a few $1,000s have to pay it up front. Now, bigger buildings, facades have to be replaced. I've seen individual unit special assessments be as high as $80,000 in the city for buildings that just have an entire facade of a 40-story building that have to be redone. So it could get crazy. Out here in the suburbs, it's less, it's usually not as dramatic because the cost to do some of the stuff is not as extreme to try to resurface an entire building that's 40 stories tall. Using union labor, so that is not always as crazy. But that reserve study is supposed to be something that helps the HOA basically budget for the upcoming years. So if you're a buyer, you want to request that reserve study. So next thing you want to do is review the budget. Every year a HOA is required to pass a budget that's voted on by the board and reviewed by all of the owners, unit owners. Now, some HOAs have more active owners than others. I know I sit on a couple boards that no one ever shows up, and we just kind of run everything, and everyone kind of is happy with that. They trust us, right? I always look at that. If the less people that show up, that means the more trusting they are of that we're doing a good job. So that actually empowers me to make sure we're doing a better job on behalf of the other owners. So But you want to look at that budget. And I always, if you can, I always try to get a budget to, year-to-date budget actual versus actual expenses versus budget. So that's another thing if you can request that. We talked about special assessments, understanding any special assessments that have happened in the past, maybe the last 3 or 4 years, and any that might be coming up in the future. Now, they're required to disclose this, the HOA is, when you go to buy a place, and that's whether you buy it cash or you buy it with a loan. So you do want to ask that question about special assessments. Now, sometimes what I found to be better is to ask that question to the neighbor. The neighbor will be a lot more honest, not saying HOA boards won't be, but they'll probably just give you it very black and white. A neighbor might tell you, yeah, they did this here, and I've heard rumors of this coming up again, or I know of this huge expense that we're gonna have to do that I know we don't have enough money for. So sometimes doing due diligence through neighbors can be very valuable for understanding what you're buying into. The biggest thing here is, I think out of this whole list we're talking about, so number 4 is verifying that the condo is warrantable versus not warrantable. And what that means is kind of back to what we're talking about. If Fannie Mae is going to fund a loan, which is basically FHA loans, conventional loans, everything that gets sold off in the secondary market. If they're going to do it, the condo is considered warrantable. If it's not warrantable, that means that you basically have to do 20% conventional and you're going to have to, or pay cash. So that dramatically decreases the value of your buyer pool. Decreases the amount of your buyer pool and usually the amount of value that you can get for that place. So make sure that you're basically financeable is really what that translates to. You can still get financing if you're not warrantable. It's just usually going to require 80% loan to value. So, but what that means is, maybe first-time home buyers, they're limited. They really want to take care of the they want to take advantage of the FHA program where they only have to put 3.5% or 5% type loans down. Down payments down, which basically says, all right, I can't even buy anything in this entire complex or this entire building because I have to put 20% down. So it kind of takes it off the block, so you're limiting your buyers there if you're not warrantable. So make sure it is warrantable because that's important. For me, this flip we're doing, my intention is to sell it to someone that is a first-time home buyer and they're gonna put 3.5% down, so I wanted to make sure it was warrantable. Insurance renewal. Another big thing around HOAs right now is they are struggling to get insurance. A lot of what we're talking about here today and the increase from 10 to 15% and asking these type of questions or make sure you know these answers is all in, we all heard it in 2021, the Champlain Towers in Surfside, Florida, that big collapse. And ever since that's happened, insurance premiums have gone up crazy for HOAs. Not only have all these other crazy events, the hurricanes, the wildfires and all that, increase insurance premiums, but overall HOA insurance is up dramatically and that can make or break a budget as well too. So understanding when the last renewal was and what their increase was or any upcoming increases that they're afraid they're gonna have. So just make sure you kind of understand that because I'm seeing sometimes insurance companies coming in and they say, hey, in order to renew your policy, we need you to replace these roofs that are way too old. And that puts the HOA in a place of like, either we're not gonna have insurance or we have to figure out how to pay for these roofs, which usually turns into a special assessment right away. So understanding kind of the timeline in the most recent insurance renewal is important as well too. One of the next things here is walk the property. Walk the property and see what the place looks like. If you see a lot of decay or tuck pointing needing or concrete broken or the driveway's a mess. The driveway, the blacktop is now white because it's so old it needs to be sealed over. Another big thing around driveways is when you see the sewers that have sunken down, that requires the usual large capital expenditure to get that fixed if the sewer collapsed. Is landscaping look horrible? Are there tons of trees that are dead on the property? You think about some of these big townhome communities or some of these condo buildings out here in the suburbs, they're sitting on 30, 40, 50 acres. And that's all area that has to be upkept and insured. So you definitely have a larger budget for those. So if you're seeing things worn down, that's huge. And that could be a big foreshadowing into what you could be up against as an investor in that complex. And then factoring in amenities. If you're looking at amenities for an association, if they have a pool, their insurance is going to be much higher. It's a much larger expense to upkeep. These concrete pools that I put in 30 years ago require maintenance and sometimes rebuilding. So I've actually seen dozens of HOAs out here in the suburbs fill in their pool and make it a little play area. The fence is already there, so they fill it in, they throw some turf down, and they will turn it into a park. So keep that in mind too. A pool is always going to be so much more expensive if they have them on site. If you have doorman or you got elevator man, those do exist still. They will be, obviously you have that expense. Those salaries continue to go up. Some of them are union and you have the union negotiation. So the amenities that are offered will often play into how efficiently a building can be run or how inexpensively a building can be run. It might seem simple to you, but there ends up being all these little things that each amenity that you have will add on a layer of cost to that association that ultimately you're paying for. So I just labeled off there 7 things that I want to make sure that you're considering. Again, the big news break here was that they're requiring the HOAs to carry 15% of their annual budget in reserves versus 10%. So that's a big deal. If you're on an HOA, if you're in an HOA, you might want to share this with your HOA manager or your board to make sure that they're meeting these requirements as soon as possible. So if you have any additional questions about HOAs, happy to help you. I am not giving any legal advice. I'm not an attorney, but I am a property manager, and we do manage a lot of condos for individual owners inside of HOAs, where we then become the direct point of contact for the HOA manager. So if there's something we can help you with or take property off your hands and be able to manage it for you, we're happy to help you. We also offer tenant placement services, which we're also always able to, on a dime, get your place listed and find you an awesome tenant within a few weeks. So talk to you soon and reach out anytime.